An American ordnance officer picked up the weapon from the workbench and nearly dropped it, not because of the weight, but because of what had been done to it. Somebody had taken a hacksaw to an L1A1 self-loading rifle, one of the finest battle rifles ever manufactured, a weapon respected by militaries across the free world, and butchered it. The barrel had been hacked short at the front sight post. The flash suppressor was gone. A crude forward grip, carved from scrap hardwood and bolted to the shortened forestock, jutted out at an angle that violated every principle of weapons engineering he had ever been taught. He turned the rifle over in his hands, examining the rough cuts, the welding marks, the stripped-down receiver that had been modified to accept 30-round magazines never intended for this platform. Then he looked at the Australian SAS trooper standing across the garage at Nui Dat, grinning through a face so weathered and filthy it could have belonged to a man who had been sleeping in a swamp for a month. "That's not a rifle anymore," the American said. The Australian shrugged. "Doesn't need to be." He was right. What he was holding was something far more dangerous than a rifle. It was the physical embodiment of a military philosophy so alien to American thinking that the Pentagon would spend the next 3 decades trying to understand it, and arguably still hasn't fully succeeded. Because in the jungles of Phuoc Tuy Province, between 1966 and 1971, a force of barely 580 Australian Special Air Service soldiers conducted nearly 1,200 combat patrols, eliminated at least 492 confirmed enemy fighters, and lost only 2 men killed in direct combat. That ratio was not achieved with superior technology or overwhelming firepower. It was achieved with hacksaws, jungle rot, and a willingness to destroy perfectly good weapons because those weapons were designed for the wrong war. To understand why Australian soldiers systematically mutilated their own rifles before walking into the Vietnamese jungle, you first need to understand the weapon they were destroying, and more importantly, the war it was built to fight. The L1A1 self-loading rifle was the Australian military's standard infantry weapon throughout the Vietnam era. Manufactured under license at the Lithgow Small Arms Factory in New South Wales, it was a semi-automatic variant of the legendary Belgian FN File, chambered in 7.62 by 51 mm NATO. The weapon measured 1,090 mm in overall length, with a 533 mm barrel, and weighed just under 5 kilograms loaded. It could place accurate fire on a man-sized target at 600 meters. Its gas-operated action was supremely reliable in adverse conditions. Its heavy 7.62 NATO round could punch through vegetation, light cover, and human tissue with devastating authority. The FN Fal family had earned the nickname the right arm of the free world for good reason. Over 90 countries adopted some variant of the design, making it one of the most widely used military rifles in history. Approximately 220,000 of these rifles rolled off the Lithgow production line between 1959 and 1986, equipping the Australian Defence Force through some of the most consequential decades of its modern history. The weapon became so deeply identified with the Australian soldier that veterans who carried it decades later would still speak of the SLR with something approaching affection. It was heavy, it was long, it demanded respect from the shooter, and it delivered results that inspired a loyalty bordering on devotion. Australian soldiers, by and large, loved the weapon. They trusted it in ways that American troops never fully trusted the M16 during its troubled early deployment. The SLR's 7.62 NATO round was heavier and slower than the American 5.56 millimeter cartridge, but at jungle ranges where engagements happened at 15 to 30 meters, stopping power mattered more than velocity. The SLR round hit hard. It stayed on course through thick vegetation where the lighter 5.56 could deflect off branches and leaves. When it struck a human body, the target went down and stayed down. The early M16, meanwhile, had arrived in Vietnam with a reputation that was being destroyed by the jungle almost as fast as American confidence in it. The weapon had been billed as self-cleaning, which no weapon is. It was issued to troops without adequate cleaning kits or proper instructions. A change in propellant powder from DuPont's IMR 8208M stick powder to Olin Matheson's WC 846 ball powder produced dramatically more fouling, which jammed the action unless the weapon was cleaned frequently and thoroughly. The original design lacked a forward assist, rendering the rifle inoperable when it jammed. It lacked a chromed barrel and chamber, causing corrosion in the tropical humidity that contributed to case swelling and extraction failures. American soldiers died in firefights with their M16S disassembled on the ground in front of them, desperately trying to clear malfunctions in the middle of combat. A congressional investigation eventually catalogued these failures in damning detail. Australian infantrymen who served alongside American units frequently commented on the difference. American troops could put more rounds downrange faster with the lightweight M16, but the Australians watching those same firefights saw enemy fighters absorb multiple 5.56 hits and keep moving for several critical seconds before collapsing. In the Vietnamese jungle, where contact distances were measured in meters rather than hundreds of meters, those seconds could be the difference between a clean kill and a dead Australian. So the rifle was trusted. The rifle was effective. The rifle was one of the best battle weapons on the planet. And the Australian SAS took hacksaws to it anyway. The modifications began almost as soon as Australian Special Operations Forces deployed to South Vietnam. The SAS troopers who arrived at Nui Dat in 1966 came with hard-won experience from the jungles of Malaya and the border fighting in Borneo during the Indonesian confrontation. They understood something about jungle warfare that their American allies had not yet grasped, and in some ways never would. The jungle is not a battlefield. It is a living environment that punishes every piece of equipment, every doctrine, and every assumption not specifically adapted to its realities. The standard L1A1, for all its virtues, had been designed for European warfare. Its long barrel and overall length were optimized for engagements across open terrain, where a rifleman might need to hit targets at 400 meters or more. Its semi-automatic action, firing controlled single shots, reflected a doctrine built around precision marksmanship at range. Everything about the weapon assumed that the shooter could see his target from a considerable distance, take careful aim, and deliver accurate fire. In the triple canopy jungle of Phuoc Tuy province, average visibility was between 10 and 15 meters, sometimes less. A rifle designed to reach out to 600 meters was carrying 585 meters of unnecessary capability, and every millimeter of that unnecessary barrel length was a tactical liability. The full-length barrel snagged on vines. It caught on bamboo. It tangled in the thick undergrowth that pressed in from every side during movement through primary jungle. Every snag required stopping. Every stop meant breaking the patrol's rhythm. Every broken rhythm generated noise. And in the Vietnamese jungle, noise was the most reliable way to die. The SAS troopers who had survived Borneo knew this in their bones. During the Confrontasi, Australian soldiers had patrolled through terrain so dense that visibility rarely exceeded 3 meters. They had learned that the length of your weapon directly determined how much noise you made moving through vegetation. They had watched men die because a barrel caught on a vine at the wrong moment, creating a sound that carried to an enemy listening post 100 meters away. So they did what soldiers have done throughout the history of warfare. When standard equipment doesn't match the environment, they adapted, quietly, unofficially, and in direct violation of regulations that prohibited modification of issued weapons. The process was straightforward in execution and radical in implication. A squadron armorer would take a standard issue L1A1 and cut the barrel down at the front sight post, removing roughly 15 centimeters of barrel length. In some cases, a shortened cone-shaped flash hider was welded onto the exposed muzzle. The stock was shortened or replaced with the shortest available variant. Then came the modification that truly horrified American weapons specialists. The armorer would alter the sear mechanism, converting the rifle from semi-automatic to fully automatic fire. A 30-round magazine from the L2A1, the heavy-barrel automatic rifle variant of the same weapon family, was fitted to replace the standard 20-round box. Finally, a forward pistol grip, sometimes manufactured from scrap metal, sometimes carved from hardwood, sometimes repurposed from another weapon entirely, was attached to the shortened forestock. The result looked like it had been assembled by guerrillas in a basement workshop. It had none of the clean lines, none of the precision finish, none of the military specification polish of the weapon it had once been. American ordnance officers who examined these modifications produced detailed reports cataloging every sin committed against firearms engineering. The barrel shortening had destroyed the weapon's ballistic profile. The effective range had been cut by more than 60%. The loss of the original flash suppressor meant the weapon would produce a massive muzzle flash with every shot, destroying the shooter's night vision and revealing his position. The conversion to full automatic in a weapon never designed for sustained automatic fire meant the barrel would overheat rapidly. Accuracy would degrade to near zero after the first few rounds of any burst, and the bolt's twisting action, combined with the now lighter overall weight, would make the weapon nearly impossible to control. The Australians called it the bitch, and the name was accurate. The weapon kicked violently in automatic fire. The bolt's twisting motion threw the muzzle in unpredictable directions. Holding anything resembling a grouping past the first 2 rounds of a burst was physically impossible for most shooters. By every metric the American military used to evaluate a weapons system, the bitch was an abomination. By every metric that actually mattered in the Vietnamese jungle, it was perfect. The logic was brutal in its simplicity. Australian SAS patrols operated in teams of 4 to 5 men. Their primary mission was reconnaissance. They moved through enemy-controlled territory for days or weeks at a time, gathering intelligence on Viet Cong movements, positions, and strength. Their survival depended on never being detected. The ideal patrol was one where no shot was ever fired, because no enemy ever knew the Australians were there. But patrols did make contact. When an SAS team was discovered, what the Australians called being bumped, the immediate tactical imperative was not to win a firefight. It was to break contact and disappear before the enemy could bring reinforcements to bear. 4 or 5 men cannot win a sustained engagement against the platoon and company-sized forces that typically operated in Viet Cong territory. What they could do was deliver a single, devastating burst of violence so sudden and so overwhelming that the enemy would be momentarily stunned, and in that moment of shock, the patrol would disengage and vanish into the jungle. This was where the bitch earned its name and its reputation. When an SAS point man rounded a bend in a trail and found himself face to face with an enemy patrol at 3 meters, he didn't need a precision rifle. He needed a weapon that would empty 30 rounds of 7.62 NATO into the kill zone in approximately 2 seconds, producing a wall of noise, muzzle flash, and devastation that would stop everything in front of it, while simultaneously convincing any nearby enemy forces that they had just encountered something considerably larger than a 5-man patrol. The bitch delivered exactly that. Its shortened barrel produced a thunderous report far louder than a standard rifle, the ballistic equivalent of a flashbang grenade. The muzzle flash in the dim jungle light was blinding. The 30 rounds of 7.62 NATO, even fired wildly inaccurately, produced a cone of destruction at close range that was nearly impossible to survive. And the volume of fire coming from what sounded like a heavy machine gun rather than a modified rifle created the auditory illusion of a much larger force engaging. In the time it took an enemy fighter to process what was happening, the Australian point man had emptied his magazine. The patrol had begun its break contact drill, and within seconds the team was moving away through the jungle, using the very silence that their modified weapons and shortened profiles allowed. The chaos left behind, the bodies, the ringing ears, the confusion about how many attackers there had been, bought the patrol the minutes it needed to disappear. The weapons stayed in Vietnam. This is a detail that speaks volumes about the unofficial nature of the modifications and the military bureaucracy's relationship with what the SAS was doing. When a squadron completed its 12-month rotation and returned to Australia, the modified rifles did not go home with them. They were passed to the incoming squadron, veteran operators sitting down with the new arrivals and explaining how each weapon handled, what its quirks were, which modifications worked best. The bitch rifles became institutional property of the war itself, artifacts of adaptation that existed only in the combat zone where they were needed. Interestingly, the SAS also modified other weapons in their arsenal. Photographs from the period show M16 rifles fitted with experimental Colt X M148 underbarrel grenade launchers, giving patrol members the ability to deliver 40mm high-explosive rounds in addition to rifle fire. Some operators carried both an M16 with grenade launcher and their modified L1A1, choosing which weapon to employ based on the specific tactical situation. The weapons were camouflaged with paint applied in patterns that broke up the distinctive outline of a rifle, another small adaptation that contributed to the overall doctrine of invisibility. As the war progressed and the Viet Cong became familiar with SAS insertion techniques, the Australians adapted again. By 1970, helicopter insertions that had once been routine were becoming dangerous, with enemy forces sometimes firing on landing zones almost immediately. The SAS responded with what they called cowboy insertions. The helicopter carrying the patrol was followed by a second helicopter with a backup team. Both patrols would be inserted and travel together for 5 minutes. The second patrol would then stop and wait, while the first continued its mission. If there was no enemy contact, the second patrol returned to the landing zone for extraction. If there was contact, the second team was already on the ground and positioned to assist. It was another example of the SAS philosophy in action. When the environment changed, the methods changed with it. The Australian military eventually acknowledged the practical wisdom behind the modifications by producing an official shortened variant, designated the L1A1-F1. This version used the shortest available stock and a shortened flash suppressor, reducing overall length by about 7 centimeters. It was a compromise, a bureaucratic nod to what the SAS had been doing with hacksaws. The operators tolerated it. They also continued modifying weapons beyond what the F1 specification permitted, because the official variant didn't go far enough. But the weapon modifications were only one element of a broader philosophy that separated Australian jungle warfare from everything the Americans were doing. The bitch was not created in isolation. It was the logical product of a doctrine that prioritized adaptation to environment over adherence to specification, survival over standardization, results over regulations. That doctrine had been forged across decades of small wars that the Australian military had fought in environments remarkably similar to Vietnam. The lessons began in Malaya. When the Malayan emergency erupted in 1948, communist guerrillas of the Malayan Communist Party launched an armed insurgency against the British colonial government that would last 12 years. Australian forces deployed as part of the British Commonwealth effort to suppress the insurgency in the jungles of the Malay Peninsula. The 2nd Battalion, Royal Australian Regiment, arrived in Penang in 1955, followed by the 3rd Battalion in 1957. The terrain was equatorial rainforest, dense and unforgiving, where visibility could be measured in single meters, and a patrol might take 9 hours to sweep a single mile. The enemy was an indigenous guerrilla force that knew the jungle intimately and used it as both weapon and refuge. Conventional military approaches, the kind of set-piece operations that had worked against the Japanese in the Pacific, proved catastrophically ineffective against this kind of opponent in this kind of terrain. The British and Australians learned, slowly and painfully, that jungle counterinsurgency required a fundamentally different approach. The lessons were paid for in blood and frustration. Australian battalions spent months conducting extended patrols through rubber plantations and primary jungle, hunting an enemy that melted away before contact could be made. 39 Australian servicemen died in Malaya, 15 of them in operations, but the survivors brought home something more valuable than any tactical victory. They brought home understanding. The key lessons were straightforward but revolutionary for Western armies. Small patrols were more effective than large formations. Stealth was more important than firepower. Patience was a tactical advantage. Understanding the local population mattered more than occupying territory, and adaptation to the environment, rather than attempting to dominate it with technology, was the only path to survival. Australian soldiers who served in Malaya between 1950 and 1960 absorbed these lessons at the cellular level. They brought them home and institutionalized them in the training programs at the Jungle Training Centre at Canungra in Queensland, a facility that would become one of the most demanding military schools in the Commonwealth. Canungra did not merely teach jungle warfare as a set of techniques. It embedded the jungle mindset into every soldier who passed through its gates. The instructors were veterans of Malaya, men who had spent months tracking communist guerrillas through equatorial rainforest and who carried the scars, both physical and psychological, of that experience. They taught their students that the jungle was neutral. It did not favor the defender or the attacker, the technologically advanced or the primitive. It favored the adapted. The soldier who understood the jungle, who moved through it as though he belonged there, who read its signs and respected its rules, would survive. The soldier who tried to impose his will on it, who crashed through it with heavy equipment and rigid doctrine, would not. This philosophy was not rhetoric. It was survival doctrine validated by years of operational experience, and it would be further refined in the next conflict that called Australian soldiers into the jungle. When the Indonesian confrontation broke out in Borneo in 1962, Australian forces deployed with a jungle warfare capability that had been continuously refined for over a decade. Borneo added its own lessons. The terrain along the Sarawak-Kalimantan border was even more demanding than Malaya, a wall of mountainous jungle that climbed toward cloud-shrouded ridgelines where the air was so thick with moisture that weapon mechanisms rusted overnight. Operations were conducted under extreme secrecy, with Australian units crossing into Indonesian territory on classified missions codenamed Claret. The 3rd Battalion, Royal Australian Regiment, conducted 32 of these cross-border operations, each one a high-wire act of military precision where a single mistake could trigger an international incident. 7 Australian soldiers were killed in operations during the confrontation, and 8 were wounded. But the soldiers who survived those border crossings had acquired something that could not be taught in a classroom or replicated in a training exercise. They had learned to fight invisible wars in impossible terrain, where the consequences of detection were not merely tactical but strategic. It was in Borneo that the Australian SAS refined the patrol techniques that would make them so devastatingly effective in Vietnam. The slow, deliberate movement that American observers would later find so maddening, the absolute silence discipline that made 4 armed men invisible in dense vegetation, the environmental adaptation that meant wearing the jungle rather than fighting through it. The SAS operators who deployed to South Vietnam in 1966 arrived with skills that had been sharpened across 2 jungle wars spanning 15 years. They were not learning jungle warfare in Vietnam. They were applying mastery achieved elsewhere. This institutional memory was something the American military simply did not possess. The United States had fought in the Pacific jungles during the Second World War, but those lessons had been largely forgotten in the intervening decades of nuclear strategy, European defense planning, and Korean conventional warfare. When American troops arrived in Vietnam in force in 1965, they brought a doctrine optimized for a hypothetical mechanized war on the plains of Central Europe. They brought weapons designed for long-range precision. They brought logistic systems designed for high-tempo operations with massive supply chains. They brought assumptions about the nature of combat that the Vietnamese jungle would systematically dismantle. The contrast between Australian and American approaches was starkest in how each force handled the jungle itself. American doctrine treated the jungle as an obstacle to be overcome. Defoliants stripped away canopy. Rome plows bulldozed trails. Napalm burned clearings for landing zones. Helicopter insertions announced the arrival of American forces with a roar audible from kilometers away. The environment was the enemy, to be destroyed or pushed aside so that American technology could function. As historian Albert Palazzo observed, when the Australians entered the Vietnam War, they brought their own well-considered concept of war that was often contradictory to or in direct conflict with American concepts. General William Westmoreland himself reportedly complained that the 1st Australian Task Force was not being aggressive enough. The American measure of success was the body count. Australian battalion commanders reportedly held that metric in contempt. Australian doctrine treated the jungle as a tool to be used. The jungle provided concealment for patrols that knew how to move through it without disturbance. It provided cover against the firepower that the Viet Cong lacked the resources to project through dense vegetation. It provided information to soldiers trained to read broken vegetation, disturbed leaf litter, and the silence patterns of birds and insects. And perhaps most importantly, the jungle provided equality. In the jungle, the billion-dollar arsenal of American military technology was reduced to what one soldier could carry, see, and hear within a 15-meter radius. On those terms, the Australian trooper with his mutilated rifle, his jungle-rotted clothing, and his 15 years of institutional jungle experience was the most dangerous thing walking through those trees. The SAS patrols that operated out of Nui Dat became the eyes and ears of the entire 1st Australian Task Force. Based on top of the Nui Dat feature on a position that became known simply as SAS Hill, the squadrons built up a formidable reputation for both accurate intelligence gathering and devastating combat effectiveness. Their intelligence was the foundation upon which all major operations in Vuok Tui Province were planned. A typical patrol would be inserted by helicopter into a designated area, then spend anywhere from 5 days to 3 weeks moving through enemy territory, observing, documenting, and reporting on Viet Cong activity. The standard patrol consisted of 5 men, no more. Each of the 3 Sabre squadrons, 1st, 2nd, and 3rd, rotated through Vietnam on year-long deployments, completing 2 tours each between 1966 and 1971. The New Zealand SAS operated alongside them, with New Zealand troopers attached to each Australian squadron, creating a combined ANZAC special operations capability that punched far above its weight. The squadrons operated not only throughout Vuok Tui Province, but also into Bien Hoa, Long Can, and Binh Tui provinces. Their range extended from the coastal flats to the mountainous jungle strongholds of the Mae Tao Range in the northeast, where the Viet Cong had established base areas that conventional forces found nearly impossible to penetrate. It was the SAS's task to locate and report on enemy routes through these mountains, and the intelligence they gathered directly shaped major battalion-level operations. When the 6th Royal Australian Regiment mounted a month-long operation to clear the Mae Tao Mountains in late 1969, the operation's success was a direct result of information painstakingly gathered by SAS patrols that had spent weeks moving through those same mountains at walking speeds most people would find difficult to believe. The movement discipline was extraordinary by any military standard. Australian SAS patrols moved through the jungle at speeds that American observers found incomprehensible. Where American long-range reconnaissance patrols covered 2 to 3 kilometers per day, Australian patrols sometimes moved as slowly as 100 meters per hour. Each step was placed with surgical precision on ground that would support weight without creating compression marks or sound. After each step, the patrol froze. Complete stillness. The troopers would remain motionless for minutes at a time, scanning their surroundings with their eyes only, never turning their heads. They read the jungle the way a predator reads a landscape, processing every sound, every absence of sound, every subtle shift in light and shadow. The silence was absolute. Communication was conducted through a system of physical touches so subtle that an observer standing 3 meters away might miss them entirely. A hand on the shoulder, a tap on the arm, fingers held in specific configurations against the back of the man ahead. No voice, no hand signals visible to an enemy, no whispered words. The only sounds the patrol produced were the sounds the jungle made anyway, and the jungle covered even those with its constant background symphony of insects and birds. This was where the shortened rifles proved their worth beyond the breaking contact scenario. A standard-length L1A1 moving through dense vegetation was a noise generator. The barrel caught vines, the stock snagged branches, the flash suppressor hooked on creepers. Each interaction produced sound, sometimes a barely audible rasp, sometimes a sharp crack that could carry dozens of meters. Multiply those small sounds across 4 hours of movement, and you had an auditory signature that an experienced Viet Cong scout could read like a newspaper. The bitch, with its chopped barrel and shortened profile, slid through vegetation. The forward grip allowed the operator to guide the weapon through tangles with one hand, while using the other to part branches silently. The reduced overall length meant fewer contact points with the environment. Fewer contact points meant less noise. Less noise meant survival. The results were documented with a precision that left no room for interpretation. In a 6-year period, the Australian and New Zealand SAS in Vietnam conducted nearly 1,200 patrols. They confirmed 492 enemy killed, with an additional 106 listed as possibly killed. They wounded at least 47 and captured 11 prisoners. Their own losses totaled 1 killed in action, 1 died of wounds, 3 accidentally killed, 1 missing, and 1 death from illness. 28 men were wounded. 580 soldiers served in the SASR in Vietnam across the entire deployment. The kill ratios were the highest of any Australian unit in the conflict, and among the highest achieved by any Allied force during the entire war. American commanders who examined these figures struggled to reconcile them with what they observed of Australian methods. The Australians moved slowly. They used small teams. They carried mutilated weapons. They wore sandals made from tire rubber to disguise their tracks. They stopped using soap and deodorant weeks before a patrol to eliminate the chemical scent signatures that the Viet Cong had learned to detect from hundreds of meters away. By every measure of conventional military professionalism, they looked primitive. And yet, the numbers could not be argued with. The enemy's own documentation confirmed what the statistics suggested. Captured Viet Cong documents revealed that separate tactical guidance existed for engaging Australian versus American forces. The guidance for American forces emphasized their predictability, their detectable scent signatures, their noise discipline failures, and their reliance on patterns that could be exploited through careful ambush planning. The guidance recommended aggressive engagement. For Australian forces, the guidance was different in kind, not merely in degree. Australian patrols were described as extremely difficult to detect. They could not be smelled. They could not be heard. Their counter-tracking techniques made trail following impossible. The recommended approach was avoidance. Units were instructed not to engage unless absolutely necessary, not to attempt ambush because Australians were more likely to detect the trap than walk into it, and not to pursue because Australian counterattack capabilities made such efforts dangerous. The Viet Cong reportedly used a specific term for Australian SAS soldiers that carried almost supernatural connotations. Ma Rung, the jungle ghosts, the phantoms, in a conflict where the Vietnamese guerrilla was supposed to be the ghost, the invisible presence melting in and out of the jungle at will, The Australians had turned that dynamic on its head. They had become something that frightened the fighters, who frightened everyone else. The fear had measurable consequences beyond captured documents. Enemy activity in areas where Australian forces operated was consistently lower than in adjacent American-controlled sectors. Viet Cong units that aggressively engaged American forces in one area refused to enter Australian territory in the neighboring sector. When they did operate in Puak Tua, their behavior changed completely, becoming defensive and cautious rather than offensive and aggressive. One former Viet Cong leader was quoted after the war, saying something that encapsulated the difference. The Americans, he said, would hit them, then call for planes and artillery. The Australians were different. With the Australians, you would see all your men killed in the blink of an eye, and that was how you knew they were in the area. The journalist Neil Davis, who spent a decade covering the war, later said he was very proud of the Australian troops, noting their professionalism, their training, and their restraint with civilians. But the weapon modifications that made all of this possible were never simple acts of field expedience. They were expressions of a complete military philosophy, one that accepted the fundamental truth that equipment must serve the environment rather than forcing the environment to accommodate the equipment. The American military spent billions of dollars attempting to reshape the Vietnamese jungle to suit American weapons and American doctrine. Defoliants, sensors, electronic surveillance, helicopter assault, massive artillery concentrations, strategic bombing. The technology was awe-inspiring. The results were ambiguous at best. The Australians spent a few hours with a hacksaw and a welding torch, reshaping their weapons to suit the Vietnamese jungle. The technology was primitive. The results were unambiguous. This is not a simple story about clever modifications to a rifle. It is a story about institutional culture and its consequences. The American military of the 1960s was built on principles that had produced victory in the Second World War and a stalemate in Korea. Speed, aggression, firepower, technological superiority. These principles had made the United States the dominant military power on Earth. They were articles of faith, embedded so deeply in institutional DNA that questioning them was career suicide for any officer who valued his future. The Australian military had no such institutional investment in these principles. Australia's military tradition was built on small wars, colonial policing, and operations at the margins of empire, where resources were always limited and adaptation was not optional but existential. The Boer War had taught Australians about fighting an elusive enemy in difficult terrain. Gallipoli had taught them about the consequences of rigid doctrine applied to unsuitable conditions. Malaya had taught them about jungle warfare. Borneo had refined those lessons to a fine edge. When Australian soldiers looked at a standard-issue rifle and saw a weapon that didn't fit the jungle, they modified it. When American soldiers looked at the same problem, they wrote reports requesting that the jungle be modified instead. The tragedy embedded in this comparison is measured in names on a wall. The lessons that the Australians had learned and were willing to share freely were available to any American commander willing to listen. Individual Americans recognized the value of Australian methods. American long-range reconnaissance patrol units trained alongside the SAS and adopted elements of their doctrine. The MACV Recondo School used Australian instructors. Some of the most effective American special operations techniques of the later war years were directly informed by Australian practices. But institutional change moved slowly, and in Vietnam, slow meant casualties. The Pentagon was not interested in reports suggesting that its methods were failing, while the methods of a small Allied force were succeeding. The evidence was filed. The recommendations were noted. The modifications to doctrine were discussed in classified briefings and deferred to future review. Australian SAS personnel also served as instructors at the MACV Recondo School, where American long-range reconnaissance patrol operators were trained. They later helped establish the LRRP training wing at the Van Keep Training Center in Puoc Tuy Province. American Special Forces, who trained under Australian instructors, often came away with a profound respect for the methods they had been taught and a sobering awareness of how far their own doctrine needed to evolve. David Hackworth, one of the most decorated American officers of the Vietnam era, later praised Australian methods extensively. He observed the techniques he had seen Australians using successfully in the late 1960s did not become standard American practice until decades later. Meanwhile, American patrols continued walking into ambushes carrying weapons designed for a different continent, wearing uniforms that advertised their presence, moving at speeds that announced their location, and dying in numbers that a different approach might have prevented. But there is a dimension to this story that the statistics do not capture, and the tactical analysis tends to overlook. The men who carried these modified weapons through the jungle paid prices that extended far beyond the physical risks of combat. Operating in 5-man teams for weeks at a time in enemy territory, maintaining the constant hypervigilance that survival demanded, suppressing every normal human impulse toward noise, movement, and social interaction, left marks that did not fade when the patrol ended. The psychological transformation required to move at 100 meters per hour through enemy-held jungle, to exist in a state of pure sensory awareness for days without the normal operations of human consciousness, was not something that reversed when the helicopter lifted the patrol back to Nui Dat. Veterans described difficulties readjusting to civilian life that exceeded what standard post-traumatic stress models would predict. The hypervigilance that kept them alive in the jungle persisted for years and decades after service. The emotional suppression they had trained themselves to maintain as a survival mechanism interfered with the relationships that civilian life required. Post-traumatic stress rates among Australian Vietnam veterans would eventually be significant, a reminder that effectiveness in war and wholeness in peace are not the same thing. Private David Fisher, a national serviceman serving with 3rd Squadron SAS, became the last Australian soldier declared missing in action in Vietnam. In September 1969, during a patrol near the Nui Mae Tao Mountains, his team made a series of sharp contacts with Viet Cong forces. Outnumbered and pursued through the jungle, they called for helicopter extraction. During the extraction, Fisher fell from the rope into the jungle canopy. His body was not found for nearly 40 years, finally recovered in 2008. He had been 20 years old. He had 2 months left on his tour. Fisher's story is a reminder that the extraordinary statistics of the SASR in Vietnam, the nearly 1,200 patrols, the lopsided kill ratios, the near-mythical reputation were achieved by individual human beings who bled, suffered, and in some cases never came home. The bitch rifle was a tool. The jungle was an environment. The tactics were a methodology. But the men who carried those tools through that environment, using that methodology, were flesh and blood, and some of them were consumed by the very war they fought so effectively. The modern legacy of what the Australian SAS proved in Vietnam is embedded in special operations doctrine worldwide, often without proper attribution. When the United States finally undertook serious reform of its special operations capabilities in the 1980s, the principles that emerged would have been instantly recognizable to anyone who had watched an Australian SAS patrol preparing their equipment at Nui Dat in 1968. Small unit tactics, operator judgment over rigid doctrine, stealth over firepower, adaptation to environment. The understanding that a modified weapon in the hands of a soldier adapted to his environment will outperform a perfect weapon in the hands of a soldier fighting his environment. Delta Force, the expanded SEAL teams, the entire apparatus of modern American unconventional warfare carries DNA that can be traced directly to those garages at Nui Dat, where men took hacksaws to precision rifles and created something that looked like insanity and performed like genius. It is worth pausing to consider the scale of what the SAS accomplished relative to the resources invested. Australia's total military commitment to Vietnam peaked at approximately 7,672 personnel. The SAS component never exceeded about 150 operators in country at any given time. Against this, the United States deployed over 500,000 troops at peak strength. The SAS operated without the massive fire support infrastructure that American forces relied upon. They had no B-52 bomber strikes on call. They had no fleet of helicopter gunships waiting to respond within minutes. They had 5 men, modified rifles, a radio, and the skills that decades of jungle warfare had sharpened to a killing edge. The first Australian task force as a whole achieved results in Phuoc Toi province that stood in sharp contrast to American operations in adjacent areas. The Battle of Long Tan in August 1966, where a single Australian company of 108 men fought off an estimated force of over 1,500 Viet Cong, killing at least 245 while losing 18, demonstrated that Australian conventional forces were equally formidable when they did commit to pitched battle. But the SAS contribution was different in kind. Where the infantry battalions fought battles, the SAS prevented them. By mapping enemy movements, identifying concentrations before they could mass for attack, and degrading enemy morale through their ghostly presence, the SAS patrols created conditions where the major battles didn't need to happen. Prevention is harder to quantify than victory, but it may be more valuable. The modified L-1A1s themselves did not survive the war. The weapons that had been passed from squadron to squadron, accumulating their own histories and reputations, their individual quirks and characteristics known intimately to the men who carried them, were never returned to Australia. They remained in Vietnam when the last Australian combat troops withdrew in 1971, artifacts of a conflict that the Australian government would spend decades attempting to process. The standard issue L-1A1s that did return to Australia were eventually retired from service in the late 1980s, replaced by the F-88 Austere. And in a final irony that the men who had once taken hacksaws to them might have appreciated, the Australian government eventually disposed of nearly all its remaining L-1A1 stockpile by melting them down or dumping them into the sea. Over 220,000 L-1A1 rifles were manufactured at Lithgow between 1959 and 1986. Of those, the small number that were modified by SAS armorers in Vietnam represented perhaps the most consequential weapons adaptation of the entire conflict. Not because the modifications were technically sophisticated. A hacksaw and a welding torch do not constitute advanced engineering, but because they represented something that no amount of technology or funding could replicate. They represented a willingness to see the war as it actually was, rather than as doctrine said it should be. That is the story of the bitch, a weapon so ugly that American ordnance officers wrote damning reports about it, so crude that photographs of it were classified partially out of embarrassment, so primitive that it looked like it belonged in a guerrilla war rather than a professional military operation, and so effective that the men who carried it through the jungles of Phuoc Toi province achieved results that the most sophisticated military machine in history could not match. An American officer looked at it and said, "That's not a rifle anymore." He was correct. It was something better. It was the right weapon for the right war, built by men who understood that the gap between what you are issued and what you need is the space where soldiers either adapt or die. The Australians adapted. Nearly 1,200 patrols, 492 confirmed enemy eliminated, 2 combat deaths in 6 years, 580 men who served across 6 years of continuous operations in some of the most dangerous terrain on Earth. Those numbers were not produced by superior technology. They were not produced by overwhelming force or unlimited budgets, or the latest generation of military hardware fresh from American defense contractors. They were produced by hacksaws, ingenuity, institutional memory stretching back through Borneo and Malaya and the Australian outback, and the hard-won wisdom that sometimes the most dangerous thing you can do with a perfectly good weapon is leave it perfectly good. The Viet Cong had a name for the men who carried these butchered rifles through their jungle: Ma Rung, the jungle ghosts. The Americans who served alongside them had simpler language. They called them the reason they were still alive. Both descriptions were accurate. Neither was sufficient, because what those men proved in the jungles of South Vietnam was something more fundamental than any tactical lesson about barrel length or movement speed. They proved that war belongs to those who adapt to it, not to those who try to make it adapt to them. That lesson cost nothing to learn and everything to ignore. The Pentagon's archives contain the evidence. The wall in Washington contains the price.